So you're probably sitting there digesting the election, and that's totally understandable and totally okay. What matters at the end of the day is this country is going to continue to rock, continue to be awesome, no matter who is in office. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be some pretty drastic structural changes, especially related to electric vehicles. Of course, Donald Trump said that he will end the electric vehicle mandate on day one.
And I will end the electric vehicle mandate on day one.
Now, technically, there is no such thing as an electric vehicle mandate, but I think we can kind of figure out what he's talking about. We are going to have to make some assumptions, though, because there's no specific electric mandate, and that could mean a wide category of things. Of course, we've got the EPA to consider. We have EV tax credits to consider. We have all kinds of different things that are happening in the government that he could be referring to. So I'm going to break this down and try to figure out what does this mean as we start to close out this year and look into next year as far as tax credits on these electric vehicles. So as you probably know by now, you can get up to $7,500 for a new electric vehicle and $4,000 for a used electric vehicle. Now, there are income limits involved, and although it's not technically a refundable credit, if you do indeed transfer this to the dealer, it would be treated as such, as there's no clawback, only if you transfer that credit to the dealer. Otherwise, you file it on your taxes and you will get up to that dollar amount depending on what your tax liability is for the year. Now, this is all a part of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act did include $12 billion in EV incentives. And quite interestingly, we have a report that from January to June of this year, $1 billion of that money has already been claimed by taxpayers in reducing the cost of purchasing an electric vehicle. About 125,000 new electric vehicles took that point of sale credit, and about 25,000 used vehicles took that credit. Now, there's also another bill that was passed, and this was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was passed that included $7.5 billion for EV chargers. So the goal is to have 500,000 chargers in the United States, and about 5 billion of that was focused on having a fast charging network from coast to coast. Now, Donald Trump has famously said, for about $10 billion, we've built 8 chargers.
For 8 chargers, they spent $9 billion.
The point is well taken, and I don't think it's unfair to call out the slow rollout of these chargers that has happened to this date. As a matter of fact, we're coming up on like 2.5 years, almost 3 years since this law was passed, and there's not a whole lot to account for it, but a lot of that is in process. So as of October 21st, there are a total of 20 NEVI chargers that are in place in 9 different states, including Hawaii, Kentucky, Maine, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Utah, and Vermont. So far, they have earmarked $500 million of that $5 billion, and they expect to build just over 3,000 chargers for that $500 million. That's all in active projects that are approved and in process. So interestingly, I was interested to find out more about this claim and how true it is. I was able to pull up a couple of interviews with Pete Buttigieg, and he didn't really deny the overall concern.
The Federal Highway Administration says only 7 or 8 charging stations have been produced with a $7.5 billion investment that taxpayers made back in 2021. Why isn't that happening more quickly?
So the president's goal is to have 500,000 chargers up by the end of this decade, engaging them in the first handful, again, by 2030, 500,000 chargers. And the very first handful of chargers are now already being physically built.
But he did continue to emphasize by 2030. So this is moving very slow. It's moving at the speed of the government. This is what happens, right? So anyways, that's another big piece of this quote EV mandate. Now here's the thing. In March of this year, the EPA passed the next level of goals that are passed to manufacturers. So the new requirements for manufacturers are, starting in 2027, they must have accounted for 56% of their vehicles being EVs and another 13% being hybrid. And they have until 2032 to make this happen. And a lot of people are taking that to mean they're going to be required to purchase an EV. And that is not the case. That is not true. Nobody is forcing anybody to buy EVs. There are strict requirements, though, coming up that are going to shift and shape the type of offerings that manufacturers are giving consumers. So you're still going to be able to buy a gas car. Even in 2032, you're going to be able to buy a gas car. It's not going to be a problem. You're just going to have more electric vehicles to choose from. And the idea is obviously to cut back on greenhouse emissions here in the United States. So let's get to the meat and potatoes. When Donald Trump says he's going to end this EV mandate on day one,
I will end the electric mandate on day one of the administration.
what does that mean? Which of these policies is at risk? And how would he do it? Well, I think all of these policies are at risk. And if you take him at his word and you try to figure out what exactly it all means, I really think that there's going to be a concerted effort to try to stop most of these things that are happening. Now, fortunately, there's checks and balances in the way our government is set up. But due to this election and how big it was, it does appear that we're going to have a Republican Senate, a Republican House, and of course the White House itself, meaning it's a lot easier to pass legislation because a lot of this can't be changed by the whip of a pen. It needs to be done through the proper channels, through law, and that is done in Congress. Okay, so first and foremost is these EPA targets, and that's probably going to be one of the bigger ones that is priority. How would Donald Trump stop these EPA targets from being a thing? They've been passed, they're in place, and that is what everybody's working towards. Well, of course, he could try to take executive action, which any of that would be taken to court, and this would drag out for months. So it's not a day one thing. Would he ultimately be successful? I don't know. There's probably some pretty creative ways to work around the law to make this work where he can overdo this. Now, of course, the head of the EPA is appointed by the president. So you can see how that might be an issue if you're hoping for these to hold place. You could just place an idiot there and tell them what to do, and that'll probably help guide you through getting things done the way you want them. Interestingly enough, the Chevron doctrine was something that went through the Supreme Court, and it basically said all these agencies, all these three-letter agencies have run amok, and they are taking too many liberties in writing rules. And this is something that the Trump administration is very likely to say, but because the way that the EPA operates, they basically go off of the Clean Air Act, and everything is done through the law, essentially, and that makes it a lot tougher to overthrow this type of stuff because it is so tied with existing law. Now, the biggest thing that is going to impact consumers, and something that we will probably see the fastest, is executive action taken to start to dismantle pieces of the IRA. Now, of course, people have commented that parts of the IRA are popular and they're a good idea, and I don't disagree, but it's not too difficult for a president to, through executive action, kind of defund some of these programs and start to tear them apart to where they're basically just sitting there and have no power to do anything. And so removing these $7,500 tax credits, the $4,000 unused, I think that's probably going to be something he can do, and he can probably do it pretty quickly. That's a bit of a problem. We'll come back to that in a moment, but I do want to point out that there's a lot of concern about, hey, this may not even be politically smart of him to do. But I do want to point you back to the fact that oil and the automotive industry, which is profitable on gas cars, not electric, is pretty powerful, and they are able to get a lot of things the way that they want through legislation, and that is not going to change overnight. In addition, you might be thinking that Donald Trump and Elon Musk have been spending a lot of time together, so I'm thinking about a Tesla, so surely I'll be protected. Well, not so fast, because even Elon Musk himself has said he does not support subsidies for these cars.
We don't need the $7,500 tax credit. I would say, honestly, I would just can this whole bill. Don't pass it. That's my recommendation.
What about the support though for the charging network? I mean, there are parts of this bill and no.
No, I mean, do we need support for gas stations? We don't. So there's no need for this for support for a charging network. I would delete it. Delete.
Okay, all right.
I'm literally saying get rid of all subsidies, but also for oil and gas.
It's a lot easier for Tesla to absorb these types of costs than anybody else because they are profitable on electric vehicles, unlike almost all of the industry. As of the last reporting, looking since the beginning of 2022, Tesla has hovered around 17 to 25% gross profit, and looking at that from an operating profit or net profit, 10 to 15%. Of course, they could cut back on CapEx and absorb some more costs, but they're not going to be able to absorb $7,500. And Tesla has been focused on taking costs out of these cars, and they've done just that. Even in spite of having these tax credits, the cost of a Tesla is definitely going to go up if the $7,500 tax credit goes away. So when you couple that with the fact that we're talking about Donald Trump, do you really think he cares about how politically popular it will be for him to dismantle any of this stuff?
I'm going to pass personally.
The answer is absolutely not. He doesn't care. He's going to do what he set out to do, and based on the way that the vote went in this country, it's going to be hard to argue against it because it was such a strong, overwhelming win that people would say, all these things I said, that's what the American people voted for. Looking at all of these things, this quote EV mandate, which would include a $7,500 tax credit, would include requiring manufacturers to have 56% of their offering be electric, 13% hybrid, and funding for EV chargers coast to coast. Those are really at risk. I think the $7,500 tax credit is the first thing to go, and I think that the funding for the NEVI chargers is the next thing to go. As far as messing with the EPA, that's going to be a lot more challenging than the others, but I think ultimately they're going to find a way to do this. All right, so let's talk about what this means for Tesla customers. So the average new car in the United States as of now for this year is $48,400. And that's down from $49,501 from earlier. So it's down modestly since its peak. When you look at a Model 3 and a Model Y, just the entry-level version, here's what we're looking at. $34,990 for the Model 3 without the tax credit. $42,490. And for the Model Y, $37,490 with the tax credit, or $44,990 without. The reason why that's important, because if you don't just look at the average new car price and you look at it by category that's appropriate for these vehicles, doesn't look so great when you remove these tax credits. Let me show you what I'm talking about. The average mid-size sedan in the United States, $33,580. The average compact SUV, $36,621. When we look at this now, comparing, we're looking at a Model 3 for $35,000 versus about $33,500 for the market, or about $1,500 more than the average mid-size sedan. That's a pretty good deal. But as soon as you remove that tax credit and it's now selling for $42,500, it's $9,000 more than the average mid-size sedan. That's a much harder sell. Over on the Model Y, it's very similar. $37,500 versus the average $36,500 in the industry, or $1,000 more. That's a fantastic deal. That's a lot of car for an extra $1,000 compared to the average compact SUV on the road. Remove that tax credit, it's now $9,000 more expensive. And this is where things continue to get very challenging when you think about this. What is Tesla going to do in response? I think we're going to see some price changes for sure into next year. And it's all going to come with timing on everything that Donald Trump is planning to do with dismantling this, quote, EV mandate. The unfortunate part is there's not enough meat on the bone for Tesla to cover the whole $7,500 that both of these vehicles are going to take a hit with. And to make things even more challenging, if they also dismantle everything else in the IRA about manufacturing the batteries in North America, that's really going to create some other challenges, and it's going to bring in some new entrants of some pretty competitive EVs. So really the only question that remains is, how is this going to impact purchasing a Tesla, and should I just go ahead and purchase one now? I think in the next couple of months, you should seriously consider, if you want a Tesla, to pull the trigger, because the risk of the cost of that going up without that tax credit is pretty strong. And the fact that even Elon Musk himself is on board with getting rid of these tax credits, I think that that's not a good sign for those of you who are counting on that. $7,500 is a lot of money, and it really makes Teslas way more affordable than most people realize. So once that's gone, these things are already going to go about $10,000 more than the average car in its class. That's going to be a big hit, not just to selling these cars, but to consumers like you who might still want to buy it. So there's a lot on the line. There's a lot that's going to change over the next several months. Make sure you're subscribed. I'll be updating any of these tax changes that happen or any of these costs with these Tesla vehicles. You can find that all right here. Make sure you're subscribed. I thank you for joining us today, and I can't wait to catch you on the next one.